Hello everyone and welcome to SEW-EURODRIVE's How-To series. We're going to be discussing how to maintain and take care of your product. So let's get into it. Today we're going to be talking about how to replace your SEW-EURODRIVE motor that is on your gearbox. And before we get into that, it's important that we mention a few safety details. First and foremost, always make sure that you've de-energized all of your equipment and that you're following all the proper lockout tagout procedures. In addition, ensure that you have all of the proper PPE in place so that you keep yourself and others safe around you. The first question that we're going to answer is, why would you need to replace your motor? Typically, it could be because of an overvoltage, or maybe it's been damaged because of something that happened during the process that the equipment is hooked to. It could be a number of things, but ultimately, you need to replace your motor, you need to do it safely, you need to do it accurately, and you need to do it quickly. So let's talk about how to get started taking your motor off of the gearbox. Now, before we start turning wrenches, let's talk about a few important reminders. First, I take a picture of the unit so that way you know how everything is oriented when you go to reassemble the new motor. Additionally, because you're working on a unit that is in service, you want to make sure you've fully drained the oil. Otherwise, when you take the old motor off, you're going to have a big mess on your hands. And finally, it's very important that you safely secure the motor. Now, depending on the size of your motor, this may mean that you use a strap and a hoist, or you may use a lift table underneath, or if it's a very small motor, you can typically lift it off by hand. The important thing to remember is to always do so in a safe manner. So let's get started disassembling. The first thing that we're going to do here is remove the nuts. It's very important that the last nut that you take off is the top nut. That way your motor doesn't fall apart suddenly and you cause damage to the components. Let's go ahead and grab our wrench and we'll begin taking the nuts off. Now loosen it just a little bit, because if this had Loctite on it in the real world, this flange may not come off very easily. In order to disassemble the motor from the gearbox in an easier manner, you can take a chisel, and you have pry points that you see here, and there's one on the back side as well. You can put your chisel in here, and you want to just pry against it. You can give it a little bit of a tap to separate, and once you've noticed that the motor and the gearbox have broken their seal, then you can finish taking off that top nut. Now, one of the reasons why we emphasize you need to have this motor secured with either a strap or a lift table or holding it is so that when you take it completely off, you again don't bump the gears into each other. So now we have our motor off. It's time to do a little bit of inspection and cleaning before we go any further. We're going to set our old motor out of the way. Now, this looks really nice and clean. The reality is your motor and gearbox are not going to look that clean. The thing that's going to happen, even though you drain the oil, you're probably going to have a little bit of residue drainage. So we want to make sure we clean that up. We want to make sure that we get rid of any bumps. And also there may be some residual Loctite that's dried up that we want to kind of clean up. You can use a Scotch-Brite pad, you can use a little bit of cleaner and a rag, and you'll be ready to do the next step. So what that looks like is, you take a little rag, a little bit of cleaner, you just want to make sure you've got all the points. It's also important just to do a touch feel with your finger to make sure you don't have any burrs or anything that would create an issue when you're doing reassembly with a new motor. So now we have our gearbox separated from the old motor. This is our new motor. One thing to point out before we begin putting the Loctite on there is that this Loctite is designed for this particular gearbox. We have a couple of different options, and it's always important that you reference the technical documentation when you're going to apply the Loctite in this situation. To begin with, we're going to put a small bead on the reducer side. And the reason we do that is because, as you'll see here, we have a couple of cutouts and you want to make sure that you don't put Loctite where it would not go when you put the motor together. I recommend you put a circular bead between the studs. And then next you want to just make a little loop around the studs themselves. Now, for extra protection, it's important that we put some Loctite on the motor. This is going to be a little bit different though, because we're going to roll it out after we've applied some of the Loctite. A medium density foam roller that you can get from your local hardware store will suffice for this step. Your goal here is to have an even coverage. You don't have to really goop it on there, you just want to make sure that you've got a good even coverage over the entire surface. And now that we've rolled it out and we've got our bead here on our reducer, it's time for us to put the two together. Now, for the purpose of instruction, I'm going to rotate the gearbox so that you can see another important aspect of putting your motor onto your gearbox. Every motor has a pinion and every gearbox has a front wheel. Those gear teeth need to mesh properly, and in order to do that and prevent damage in the reassembly process, we need to come in at an angle. So notice as we do that. You always want to start at the bottom stud hole, and you want to just walk it in slowly. Everything's seated properly. You notice that some of the Loctite is starting to squeeze out. That means you've got a pretty decent bond. Now it's time for us to add our nuts and to tighten them down. Every fastener has a torque spec to it, so you need to look at the technical specifications that SEW-EURODRIVE provides in order to ensure that you are tightening these nuts to the proper torque spec. When you tighten the nuts, you want to make sure that you tighten the bottom one first before you proceed to the other ones. You always want to start with the bottom nut, and as I'm tightening, you want to do a diametrically opposed pattern. So we're going to go to the nut across from it and tighten that one next. It's always good to go back to the first one you tightened and make sure that it's hit the spec. And now you have everything in place. It's time to do a little bit of cleanup. Again, you just need a little bit of spray, and we'll put that on there and then wipe it down with a rag. Now that I've got the Loctite cleaned off, you want to wait a little bit before you put the oil back into the gearbox. And yes, that's a good reminder, isn't it? You drain the oil, you got to put oil back into it. Make sure that you've given about 15 minutes before you start to put the oil in, so that way your Loctite is sealed properly. So now we've installed the new motor onto the gearbox, and before we go any further, let's talk about a few things. First and foremost, it's important that you inspect the unit to make sure that the old unit and the new unit match up. You're going to do this by looking at the nameplate data. That should always match, otherwise you might run into some issues when you start the motor back up. Now, in addition to that, just make sure that the conduit box and the breathers and everything is looking just like it was before you started disassembling, and as always, make sure you put the oil back into the gearbox. Now it's time to re-energize your unit. It's important that you follow the lockout tagout procedures, and as always, for anything related to this unit and others, you want to make sure that you follow all the technical specs and all of the operating instructions that we have on our website, SEW-EURODRIVE.com. So that was a lot to go through just to replace a motor. What if your downtime is critical and you want to be able to get up and running in a very fast manner? That's why we offer what we call an adapter mount motor. So let's talk about how to take care of these. Slide this out of the way, and let's get our adapter into place. So I have in front of me an example of one of our motor adapter units. Now this is a demo, so it's missing a few components, but that's okay. We're going to talk about the principle behind it. A motor adapter is designed to allow you to use any kind of motor that fits within the specs that you're dealing with in your application, and it allows you to be able to change that motor out very quickly, which reduces your downtime, reduces your expenses. How is it able to do this? Well, the motor adapter is mounted to the gearbox, so your oil stays in your gearbox, which means you don't have to change your oil by removing it and putting it back in during the motor replacement process. How is this able to happen? Well, it's because instead of connecting a pinion gear, you're connecting the motor using a coupling to the adapter. And this is going to be a quick and smooth transition. Now, just because it's quick and easy doesn't mean that we want to leave you without instructions. And so you can go to our website, SEW-EURODRIVE.com, and you can follow our technical specifications and operating instructions that will show you just how to mount your motor to this motor adapter. One other thing to think about is that you are going to have added weight, you're going to have an increased dimension, and this could mean an increase in the cost. However, that may be well worth it because you're able to get your product up and running much more quickly. And we want to make sure we follow all of the safety procedures, which means you need to make sure your unit is de-energized before you begin work. You want to make sure you inspect everything before you re-energize, and always follow lockout tagout procedures so that you can have a safe and worry-free install. If you're interested in learning more about SEW-EURODRIVE's components, products, or solutions, please go to SEW-EURODRIVE.com. Together, we drive the world.